Welcome to Echo 321, Study Session 10, Trade and Economic Development. Introduction. In the previous study session, we examined the dimensions in human capital as a pivot to economic development. In this study session, we will explore trade as a development strategy and raise critical questions about trade and development. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this session, you should be able to 1. Discuss the traditional view of the impact of trade on development. 2. Raise at least 4 basic questions about trade and development. Traditional trade theory and development. According to the so-called Smithian approach, exchange is the key engine for growth. Adam Smith was aware that resources are limited and consistent with the historical evidence of his time. Observed that technological progress played a modest role, but he also perceived that agents could enhance their welfare by exchanging goods and services. In particular, individuals with different preferences and or endowments might still improve their conditions by selling and buying goods to or from people with different tastes and skills. In other words, trade is beneficial in that it expands the opportunities to choose and thus increases individuals' welfare within a competitive framework. As for trade regimes, it is accepted that consumers always benefit from free trade. However, since some owners of production factors will gain and some will lose, as for trade regimes, it is accepted that consumers always benefit from free trade. However, since some owners of production factors will gain and some will lose as the competitive process unfolds, and since individuals are at the same time consumers and owners of production factors, the sign of the effect is not necessarily positive for everyone. This explains why when competitive pressure is fierce and agents are expected or forced to adjust, the attitude towards free trade becomes less enthusiastic. The classical economists viewed trade as one way of contributing to the wealth and capital accumulation of a nation. However, the specification of direct and continuity transmission effect of trade to the growth of the economy was never adequately spelled out. Orthodox economics argue that specialization as well as division of labor will lead to increased welfare and increased income. Increased growth would ultimately increase the standard of living and decrease poverty. Given the presumption that the problem of developing countries was that of inadequate growth and inefficiency in the utilization of allocation of resources, it was not difficult then to argue that increased trade automatically will promote development. However, the empirical evidence does not validate an automatic linkage between trade and growth. The resulting developmental and social costs of engaging in international trade, which were not configured into the framework, is now distorting the process of economic and social development in many developing countries. Such developmental costs include lack of attention to production capacity in the domestic economy due to discontinuity in industrial and development policies as a result of over-focusing on trade reform, lack of attention to human resource development, etc. The major social costs that can be linked to trade or that are trade-related include rising inequality, food insecurity, and trade liberalization induce fiscal revenue shortage, which endangers the social sector spending. Clearly, the role of trade in the national and global economy is not as straightforward as it once appeared. While the classical economist view of trade is not without some validity, as trade does seem to enrich the rich countries of today, while some developing countries seem to have also prospered from international trade, it is not necessarily so for the vast majority of developing countries, especially the less developed countries. Trade may indeed have the potential for all that is promised on its behalf, but it is clear that there are explicit and implicit adjustment costs as well as unequal sharing of the burden of adjustment between rich and poor countries. More significantly, trade has been associated with a heavy and cumbersome liberalization agenda that would seem to be increasingly pathological in its excesses and deficiencies. It not only penalizes countries that follow the rule, but whether inadvertently or by design seems to perpetuate unequal exchange and retard sustainable growth. These excesses and deficiencies that are now affecting developing countries include: 1. Excessive emphasis on promoting the freedom of choice of foreign economic agents and the goods and services they produce. This must be juxtaposed with the deficiency in the nature and extent of choice open to developing countries in setting policy parameters and objectives, especially when these conflict with trade liberalization. 2. Subsidies to agro businesses in the developed countries that result in the dumping of agricultural products by rich countries on poor countries. On the other side, there is a deficiency in commodity prices and insufficient protection for food staples such as rice in developing countries. 3. There is excessive attention to how the market works versus inadequate attention to how markets are actually developed, function, and maintained in different developing countries. 4. Excessive attention to market access and inadequate or deficient treatment of conditions and nature of domestic production and reproduction. Given these excesses and deficiencies, the conventional wisdom that traditionally located the role and value of trade in its ability to increase the standard of living, income, employment, and growth, as well as expand the basket of goods and services available, may not hold for some trading nations. Clearly, from the standpoint of economic development, there is a serious need to reevaluate all the assumptions about trade growth, employment, and consumption. Basic issues on trade and development. Developing nations are typically oriented very strongly to international trade as their main engine of growth and development. Consequently, the theory of international trade has been considered important in the explanation of national development processes. 5 basic questions about trade and development are listed below. 1. How does international trade affect the rate, structure, and character of less developed countries' economic growth? 2. How does trade alter the distribution of income and wealth within a country and among different countries? Is trade a force for international and domestic equality or inequality? That is, how are the gains and losses distributed and who benefits? 3. Under what conditions can trade help less developed countries achieve their development objectives? 4. Can less developed countries, by their own action, determine how much they trade? 5. In the light of past experiences and prospective judgment, should less developed countries adopt an outward-looking policy or inward-looking policy? Should they pursue some combinations? Import substitution and theory of protection. The argument for tariff protection under import substitution strategy is to allow the now higher priced domestic producers enough time to learn the business and to achieve the economies of scale in production and the external economies of learning by doing that which are necessary to lower unit costs and prices. With enough time and sufficient protection, the infant will eventually grow up, be directly competitive with developed country producers, and no longer need this protection. The basic theory of protection is an old controversial issue in the field of international trade. It is relatively simple to demonstrate as shown in figure 10.1. Clearly, the higher the tariff, the closer the domestic price, the sum of the domestic price plus import tax will be. In the classic infant industry import substitution scenario, the tariff may be so high that it raises the prices of the imported goods above P1 to say P3 in the upper part of figure 10.1, so that imports are effectively prohibited and the local industries is allowed to operate behind a fully protective tariff wall, once again selling Q1 output at P1 price. In the short run, it is clear that the impact of such a prohibitive tariff is to penalize consumers who are in effect subsidizing domestic producers and their employees through higher prices and lower consumption. Alternatively, we can say that a tariff will redistribute income from consumers to producers. However, in the long run, advocates of import substitution protection for less developed countries' infant industries argue that everyone will benefit as domestic and other manufacturers reap the benefits of economies of scale, and learning by doing so that ultimately the domestic price falls below P2. Production would then occur for the domestic and world market. Domestic consumers as well as domestic producers and their employees will benefit. Protective tariff can be removed and the government will be able to replace any lost tariff revenue with taxes on the now very much higher income of domestic manufacturers. Summary. In this study session, you learned that Smithian approach explained that exchange is the key engine for growth. Adam Smith was aware that resources are limited and, consistent with the historical evidence of his time, observed that technological progress played a modest role. Developing nations are typically oriented very strongly to international trade as their main engine of growth and development. Consequently, the theory of international trade has been considered important in the explanation of national development processes. This is the end of study session 10. Thanks for listening.